Do you think the organisations that really have bought into this and made allyship statements and condemned so-called transphobia, do you think they should now be apologising?
That's a really interesting question. Do I think they should be apologising?
Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working. Okay, so today we're talking about the recent Supreme Court ruling on the meaning of sex in the Equality Act and the implications for UK employers. So the last 3 weeks have been, frankly, pretty chaotic and confusing, and there's a lot of misinformation out there and emotions are running pretty high. So I've decided it's time to bring out the big guns to help us to find clarity and hopefully a way forward from here. Big gun number one is Maya Forstater, CEO of the human rights charity Sex Matters. And big gun number two is Neil Morrison, HR Director at the British water company Severn Trent. Welcome to you both. Maya, am I right in thinking this is the first time you've ever kind of spoken on camera with an HR director like this?
It is. It's a world first.
Wonderful. And Neil, welcome to you as well. Is there anything you'd like to say before we get started, either to Maya or to the audience or anything?
No, I'm just apologising for being the first. I'm sorry about that, but yeah, we'll crack on.
Okay, so the Supreme Court ruling was an important clarification that where sex, woman and man appear in the Equality Act 2010, this refers to biological sex and definitely not the gender stated on a person's gender recognition certificate or GRC. This ruling shouldn't have been huge news because it isn't a change to the law and less than 9,000 people in the UK have a GRC. However, it's brought to light the fact that lots of employers seem to have made rather a big mistake and for years been operating a sort of self-ID policy for any employees who identify as trans, regardless of whether or not they have a GRC. And that was never lawful, even before the Supreme Court ruling. So effectively, HR teams now face the rather daunting prospect of correcting that mistake while under pressure from colleagues who are disappointed and distressed by the ruling and noisy activists claiming to be experts. So frankly, it's all a bit of a mess. So let's hope we can start to find a way through it today. We're going to start with Maya. Maya, so today we're going to focus on the Supreme Court ruling primarily. But can you briefly remind our audience of who you are and why they should recognise your name?
So I sort of came into this debate by losing my job. I worked at a think tank, and in 2018, when the government was consulting on whether to bring in a legal form of gender self-ID, I tweeted about it, lost my job, went to employment tribunal and created the legal precedent that has my name on it, Forstater, that people with gender critical beliefs, so the belief that sex is real, immutable and important, which turns out not only to be a belief and biologically true, but also basically the law, as confirmed now by the Supreme Court, are protected against belief discrimination. So that was my legal precedent. Then I went on to co-found the organisation Sex Matters, which is now a charity. We're a human rights charity, and our aim is to clarify sex in law and policy in the UK. And we intervened in the For Women Scotland case in support of For Women Scotland, who were the grassroots women's group who brought it. We intervened and were commended in the judgment for bringing focus to the legal arguments about the meaning of sex in the Equality Act.
And what happened at the Supreme Court on the 16th of April? And why do you think the judges reached the conclusion that they reached?
The judgment said that sex in the Equality Act, the protected characteristic of sex, so that relates to sex discrimination, means what it meant in the Sex Discrimination Act 1975, which is the ordinary everyday meaning of sex. And they came to this conclusion by looking at the whole of the Equality Act. So really thinking, what's the purpose of the Equality Act? It's there to protect people against discrimination and harassment because of personal characteristics that they have, and also because of the groups that they're in. And it really thought about what is the group women and the group men? What does it mean? How can we think about this coherently and consistently in a way that enables the Equality Act to be understood and implemented by employers, service providers, associations, all the everyday businesses that are covered by the Equality Act. And the conclusion they came to was that the only meaning that is consistent with the purpose of the Act is biological sex.
Okay, and specifically for employers, what do you think are the main implications of the ruling?
I mean, the big takeaway is that they have misinterpreted the Equality Act for the past 15 years, basically. And they have done that under the advice of organisations that have told them that being a man or a woman is complicated, and it's something that somebody can choose to be, or it can be an identity, and have told them that saying that sex is real, that there are men and there are women, and that people who are transgender are still their biological sex is controversial or difficult. That they've spent a lot of money and a lot of time training themselves, training their staff, training the senior management to believe something that isn't true and isn't the law, and puts them at very, very real risk of liability. So they're going to have to go back to basics and really think about sex discrimination, think about men and women, and think about where in their business do they treat men and women differently, why it's lawful to do that, and why they have been enabling people to self-identify into those categories rather than treating those categories as the simple biological categories which they are. So they're really going to have to go back to basics.
Okay, we'll come back to employers in a second, just leaving them for a minute. What other reactions have we seen to the ruling? So, for example, from politicians and kind of activists, lawyers, and the public, and maybe other groups as well.
I think politicians, I mean, the Keir Starmer, the front bench of the Labour Party were relieved, I think, at the judgment. It brings clarity. It means that it doesn't have to go back to Parliament to work out what the answer is. And they welcomed the judgment, and they said that they would implement it. So I think that's good news. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is the regulator and which provides statutory guidance on the Equality Act, they also intervened in the case, and they said that they thought sex meant sex on a certificate. So they were wrong. But what they said was that if sex was sex on a certificate, then it would be very hard to implement the Equality Act. It would be very hard for employers to provide single-sex spaces and to understand the needs of women and men separately. And so, although they lost, I think they were pleased, because what they had been saying was that a biological meaning of sex is the one that makes sense, is the one that is simple and clear to implement. And so they've put out an update, which is just a sort of statement on their website about some of the practical implications of this for employers and service providers. And they're in the process of updating their statutory guidance for service providers, which they were doing anyway. They're not currently updating their guidance for employers, just because there's so much case law on the Equality Act that's taken place since 2010, that's a huge job. But the law itself is now very, very clear, and employers shouldn't be waiting for further guidance from the EHRC before they act.
There's been quite a lot of noise from activists. Were you expecting that on some level?
Yes,
I think the ones who are disappointed.
I think people have been misrepresenting the Equality Act for so long that this judgment comes as a shock to them. It shouldn't. People have been pointing out this problem, at least for the last 5 to 8 years. In 2021, Aqua Rheindorf KC did a review of Essex University and pointed out that Stonewall, which advises all of the universities, many, many large employers, has been presenting the law as Stonewall wants it to be, not as it was. That warning was put out in 2021 and people ignored it. And now it's very clear from the Supreme Court judgment that is, in fact, what's happened. And so those activists are looking around for a new narrative. And unfortunately, there isn't one. This is the law. This is the Supreme Court, and employers are going to need to pay attention to it.
One group that's been fairly clear seems to be the public, who seem to be largely on side with this. The majority of the public. Do we have any stats on how popular this ruling was with the public?
We haven't got direct stats on the ruling itself, but what we're seeing is that the public want clarity and support for people, for example, using opposite sex facilities, changing the sex on their documents and so on, and men playing in women's sports has gone down and down over the last few years as it's become, as people have become more and more aware of the issue. The support for, what was termed trans inclusion, but was a very simplistic view, has gone down. People are still inclusive. They want to be kind. They don't want to be mean to people. They want to be kind to their colleagues. But they understand that in situations where sex matters, it's not possible to allow somebody who very, very much wishes they were the opposite sex, but they're not, to be included into spaces for the opposite sex because other people have rights. And I think the general public understand that. They understand that that's not mean. It's about keeping people safe, and that in lots of cases, there are third spaces. There are ways of including people without everyone having to buy into the idea that they've changed sex.
I've been seeing on social media that, emotions are running pretty high with the people who are disappointed by this ruling. Do you have sympathy with the people who are not expecting this judgment, and who, for them, this is a really personal issue, which is going to make their day-to-day life more painful and more difficult?
I do. They've been lied to, some from a very early age. They've been lied to about the law. They've been lied to about what is possible. And they've been lied to about what they can expect from other people. And this is the cold, hard truth. And I can see why they're very disappointed.
One other thing I've heard is that some people think it was perhaps a bit distasteful that some groups and individuals were seen celebrating, for example, drinking champagne and smoking cigars. What's your response to that? I guess for people that were not expecting that news, that was quite tough to see. What's your response?
I think it's just silly. Show me somebody who's won a case in the Supreme Court over a civil liberties issue that hasn't celebrated. This was the women who brought this case were bringing a case about women's rights, about protecting women's rights, and they have every right to celebrate. And I think to expect an apology and some contrition from officials, employers who have got the law wrong for 15 years and painted them as witches, and people like me who lost our jobs, people who have been hounded and investigated at work for saying things that now the Supreme Court are saying was the law all along. I think we have every right to celebrate.
One thing I've noticed is that I think a lot of people are at very different stages of understanding what this is actually all about. And so I guess anyone listening to this who's sort of feels they need to catch up because they might have missed something, I recommend listening to previous episodes with Kate Barker, Stella O'Malley and Kelly J. Keane. We've done a really good job between the three of them of covering this from a range of different angles. So I really recommend those episodes. I've been on LinkedIn, as you know, I love LinkedIn, for the last 3 weeks. And we've seen a range of different responses from employers, which I would describe as ranging from sort of begrudging acceptance to kind of surprisingly open disappointment, with some of them even appearing to defy the ruling. I think Barclays Bank were one of the first to confirm that they would change the policies to comply with the ruling immediately, although I think that statement did follow a significant nudge by the Daily Telegraph. But this weekend I saw the CEO of Co-op Supermarket saying that they were going to wait until the EHRC guidance, which I think I saw wasn't out until June. And then at Octopus, the energy company, a poster was photographed telling all staff to use the toilets of their choice, which seemed like a possible indicator that someone there plans to defy the ruling. And there was also a senior HR person at Lloyd's Banking Group who wrote on their internal LGBT message board that she was, quote, standing in solidarity with LGBT staff, which sounded a little bit like taking a political position. I mean, from LinkedIn, what I've seen, I can tell you with certainty, is that the most vocal distress and alarm at the ruling has come from HR and DEI teams working in the NHS and the charity sector, who seem to have been completely blindsided by this, which to me suggests a massive echo chamber effect happening there. On the whole, the corporate world, which is obviously where Neil is from, seems to have been surprised but more controlled in their messaging, possibly, I think, because they're already having discussions about their DEI missteps, let's be diplomatic, more broadly. So I think there's quite a range among employers of responses. I've seen lots of different myths kind of springing up as well. And some of the activists, as you say, quite invested in trying to make some of those stick because they're very personally and financially invested in some way trying to at least create some confusion and ideally try and overturn or circumvent this ruling in some way. The main myths I've seen is that it's either that the ruling is unclear or that it's optional or that somehow it can wait. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes, absolutely. And I think I puzzled for a while over how they could say that the ruling was unclear, because I think it is a model of clarity. But if you have trained yourself or been trained to think that man and woman are self-defined identities and that it's transphobic to say that they're the two sexes, then you can kind of see how people think the judgment is unclear, because they're still trying to fit it back into that framework. And really the judgment doesn't allow that framework to, I mean, people can believe what they like in their private life, but in terms of complying with the law, it's very clear that sex means sex. And so I think that's why people are saying it's confusing, because it doesn't fit with what's in their head. But what's in their head is going to have to shift.
Okay, that might be quite a big job. I've got one more question for you about sort of language and actually anger, which I'm seeing. It strikes me that employers haven't paid very much, if any, attention in the last 3 weeks to the women who are actually really relieved by this ruling, and frankly feeling pretty bruised and angry about how this has been so badly handled by many employers, in some cases over many years. I interviewed the women's rights campaigner Kelly J. Keane a couple of weeks ago, and she represents a large number of women who are frankly running very low on patience with this stuff right now. And some of them say that they've suffered significantly as a result of policies that were always unlawful, particularly around things like single-sex spaces. And they feel they've been dismissed and silenced for many years for raising perfectly reasonable questions, concerns and complaints. Some of them are so fed up that they're no longer prepared to use the language that HR teams would consider to be polite. So, for example, Kelly J, as you probably know, doesn't use the phrase trans women. She says men pretending to be women. There's also a hashtag which is protect the dolls, which shows that some of the people that HR teams are calling in their word trans women, in fact, seem to be very clearly sexually motivated to present themselves in female clothing. And some of those photos are pretty disturbing. Now, I can see HR teams finding that kind of language and those sorts of photos quite shocking, because I don't think they appreciate the depth and scale of women's anger to this issue, because of how long it's been going on for and how bad it's got, and that it took the Supreme Court ruling to make employers take this seriously. And some employers still don't seem to get how deep this wound is. So for me, if employers wait any longer to show they take it seriously, I wouldn't be surprised if they start to see some pretty explosive reactions from their female staff who are much further along in the journey of realizing how big the implications of this are. Do you agree with that? That's something that employers should be aware of?
I think they should be aware of that. I think they should just be aware of the fact that they're breaking the law. There is no justification for waiting. I think most of these employers are guilty of harassment of their female employees. I think, when you publish a policy that says you must challenge transphobia, and by transphobia, they define that to mean recognizing that a trans woman is a man, they are creating an environment which is hostile to anyone who disagrees with that, but particularly to female staff. Because if you can't say that someone is a man, how can you start to say, and they shouldn't be in the women's showers, for example, or anything where you need to say what sex somebody is. And so, whether women have, run out of patience and are going to explode, or whether they're going to carry on being silenced because they recognise that the risk to their jobs and careers if they don't, these employers are breaching the law right now with these policies. And it's not just about toilets. I mean, toilets is really a simple thing to solve. Most large buildings, you have male and female, you have unisex. All you have to do is say, those are the clear rules. There's somewhere for everybody. We recognise women's bodily privacy and we recognise trans people's information privacy. They can use the unisex, and we're not going to ask what sex they are, but people can't use opposite sex facilities. They're not going to be happy, but that's simple. But the much harder thing, I think, is addressing this culture that they have built up and trained people in, which is that that it is transphobic, controversial, not acceptable to say these things. And they are going to have mass harassment cases on their hands, I think, in the same way that the supermarkets have had equal pay cases, the councils have had equal pay cases, where they've had a whole culture of breaking the law with impunity, institutionalized. And I wonder if the only thing that's going to get their attention is bringing those claims and making it cost.
Do you think they can trust their lawyers to give them good advice? I saw there's been a couple of examples of lawyers that might have got a bit mixed up themselves.
Well, I mean, I think everyone's got the law wrong so far. So I think, they really, really need to think carefully. If their legal counsel have been telling them that it's all fine up to now, their legal counsel have got it wrong. And so I think they really, really need to be cautious of going back to the people that they have become comfortable with, because those comfortable sources have led them completely down the wrong path.
Okay. Thank you, Maya. I'm going to go to Neil now. I've got some questions for you, Neil, but do you have any questions for Maya about any of the detail or anything that she's said there? Is that as you understood it?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that's been said, I think, in terms of fact, I think is true. The one thing I'm not as certain on is how widespread this is across organisations. I think there are definitely different pockets depending on sector and depending on kind of the type of employee base that you have in those. And so I'm not as certain that it's as widespread some of these activities. I think there are quite a small number of corporate employers that perhaps have gone into this space. I think I see it a lot in terms of public sector, and I think I see it a lot in terms of academia and some of those other areas. And I know there was a big debate in publishing, wasn't there, around this, and there was another particular kind of challenging environment. But I'm probably slightly more in the glass half full, that I think there are lots of employers that are actually doing good stuff, just cracking on and running their businesses, and perhaps haven't gone down some of the more extreme paths that Maya's articulated. But I don't know, Maya, is that fair, do you think, or have I kind of...
I think that's certainly true. I mean, I think the NHS, public sector in general, the voluntary sector, have been the places that have most vocally adopted this kind of thing, and that have the strongest sort of internal stakeholder groups that are still holding management to ransom. And you see that in the employment tribunals. They've pretty much all been public sector or voluntary sector, whereas I do think big corporates have been more sensible. And I think part of that may also be, if they're multinationals, they're used to dealing with different countries with different legal systems and social expectations, and sort of not trying to be social activists, but just taking the rules as they are in different places and trying to comply with them as best they can, and concentrate on their business. So yes, I think you're probably right there.
And do you think that's maybe where there's an overlap in terms of the type of, I suppose, employees, the type of kind of opinions they might have, perspectives that they might have, where they've hired from, the kind of education that they might have come from, that then creates a sense of kind of singular opinion? I wonder whether some of those large corporates, because you're more diverse in the types of people that you've got coming into the organisation.
I think that's probably true. I mean, having said that, we've seen training on this. It definitely started in the universities, but it's trickled down into every sector. And we've seen bad training on this in retail, for example, where retailers have bought in third-party trainers and the train, online, and the training company has said the same thing as everybody else. I mean, until before the 16th of April, that was the perceived wisdom, even though we'd had the first round of Forum in Scotland case already saying that self-ID is not the law. That was the perceived wisdom, and it was being trained into every single large corporation. And, so we have seen cases of this kind of harassment on the shop floor, in supermarkets, for example. So it's definitely not only universities and the voluntary sector, but those are the places where you have the kind of strongest ideological buy-in, I think.
I'd say also that maybe we're not seeing as many private sector employment tribunals, but I wonder if they're just being paid off. People are just being paid off before it gets to employment tribunal, whereas it seems like in the public sector, particularly I'm thinking about the Met Police case recently, Melanie Newman, and also the NHS 5 case, where you're thinking that there's somebody pushing this through, and it's almost because it's public money. It feels to me like it's because it's public money that no one's gone, hang on, we're not spending that. So, and as Neil says, I do think the corporate world, for all its many, many flaws, is actually more diverse socially and politically than some other kind of industries. So I think they are probably best placed to get themselves out of this, which is why I wanted to get Neil on this call as well. I mean, there'll be lots of people listening from all sorts of different industries, but I felt for a long time that the corporate world was going to lead out of this because of the profit driver, frankly. So capitalism may indeed kind of save us all, return us all to sanity. That's my hope. I'm just going to ask Neil a few questions, and the reason why I invited Neil on is, well, first of all, I've talked to Neil before we did 3 episodes back in the autumn where I also gave him a really, really hard time, and he was so good natured about it that I thought I'd bring him on again. So in the sort of chaos that I saw, kind of following the Supreme Court ruling, Neil published this brilliant blog post which shone to me like a beacon through the mist, which is called "Let Lawmakers Make the Law." And it seemed to be aimed at business leaders. I think that's right. And it was all about how you, Neil, feel it's not an employer's place to state whether they agree or disagree with a ruling like this. Their job is simply to follow the law. Now, why do you feel it was important or even necessary to say that? And why do you think so many other employers are not clear on their responsibilities or boundaries around this? Or maybe you don't. Maybe you think that the bad ones are not representative of the broader spectrum.
I guess a couple of things, really. I mean, I don't actually have a super strong personal opinion or view on the two sides of the debate. And I guess my sense has always been that it's complex and it needs minds that are greater than mine in order to opine on the legal definitions. And so when the Supreme Court did, that felt to me like that was a helpful thing for businesses and organisations, and should have been received in that way, as a way in saying, now I know how I need to run my organisation. Now it's really clear. The highest court in the land has opined on this, and therefore, this isn't. So it's not like some of the law that we see in business quite a lot. We'll see cases. So case law will come in, and then it will be overruled by another case that will give you a slightly different opinion or a slight, and it's a moving feast. This was a fundamental kind of understanding of the definitions of an existing piece of law. And so that clarity felt to me like that should be a good thing, regardless of which side, if you like, I don't want to say an argument, because I think it's become an argument, but I don't think it should necessarily have done that. If 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we might have entered into this in a much more sensible way. And so that for me was, as a business, what you do is you look at the law, you look at the whether it's health and safety, whether it's employment, whether it's corporate law, and you run your business and your organisation in line with the laws of the land that you're operating in, and that is what you do. So what I couldn't understand was why there were so many people in my world, in the business world, almost reacting to the decision rather than saying, crikey, this is super helpful now, because now I know exactly what I need to do and now I can get on and do it. And that doesn't stop me having an inclusive culture within my organisation. It doesn't stop me, making sure that everybody's kind to one another and you've got the right behaviours going on within the workplace. It clarifies something that actually wasn't, well, some would say wasn't clear up until that point in time, or the muddy waters around it had been muddied. And so that's really what I was trying to say, was just simply, let's use this now to get clarity, to move on, and to make sure that our organisations are operating in line with the law. And, as I said in the post, there are lots of laws that come out every year in different countries that we operate in, and some of those you agree with, some of those you don't agree with. My job is not to run my organisation depending on whether I agree or not with the law. My job is to run an organisation in line with the law. And so simply it was a point of clarity that I thought should be very, very helpful to leaders in organisations.
When we spoke last year, Neil, you said that you felt too many businesses had strayed into seeing themselves as being responsible in some way for pushing sort of social policy messaging. Would you give this as an example of or a sort of symptom, really, that is indeed what's happened in some organisations?
So I think this comes back to the question I was asking Maya about, kind of demographics within organisations, because I do think some organisations have stepped into almost social policy and away from the core of what they should be doing in terms of providing a service for their customers, their stakeholders, their service users, whoever it is. And I think, often that comes from a sense of a pressure from external bodies that can make you feel that you've got to make statements. And I think particularly in EDI, a lot of the activism has been, saying nothing is as bad as, as being complicit. And so organisations, corporations feel they've got to say something, and they end up into social policy. And I've always had a clear view that actually I don't want to control what people think. My workforce will have a variety of different views, some of which I'll agree with, some of which I won't agree with. It doesn't really matter. What I'm interested in is how they behave to one another when they're in the workplace. And if I can create a workplace where everybody is respectful of one another and actually you keep some of the views out of the workplace, that can be the easiest way of meaning that actually you can come in, you can do your job, you can get paid for doing your job. And I should have no sense of what their opinions are and how they, unless obviously they're expressed with a view to cause offence or cause harm intentionally within the workplace. And so, I think it is an example where, but I wonder whether many organisations have done it because they've been confused rather than necessarily because they've stepped in and said, I've got a strong view of what the answer is. I think some will have done. Others will, I think, have been misinformed or just confused about what the actual situation is.
Yeah, I've talked on previous episodes about how when I saw it coming in, because I was in the kind of early careers area at the time, it just it didn't feel like organisations were being lobbied, as I think they were. it felt like a sort of social movement. It felt like an extension of gay rights. It felt like something where, frankly, the downside was not obvious at the time. It was like, I mean, I guess I think about maybe 2018, 2019, and there was a bit of a sort of cultural moment. There was Caitlyn Jenner and all this kind of stuff, and Hayley from Coronation Street, and it all just sort of felt kind of what's not to love about inclusion. And I think it came in from genuinely good intentions. I think there probably were some people who were pushing an agenda, but I think one of the things that was so difficult about it was that at the same time as these ideas were coming in, this idea of no debate came in immediately at the same time. Very quickly, employers found themselves, I think, quite confused about what this was, and there was just no space for any proper conversation at that point. And there must have been people who were thinking, "Oh, hang on, I'm not sure about this. Wait, what are we saying? This doesn't seem right." But I don't think they had any space to do that. And I think over the years it became more and more difficult as these ideas kind of became embedded, particularly as LGBT staff groups, I think, became more influential as well.
Can I pick up on something that Neil said? I mean, you said, I think, that it shouldn't be a conflict or a sort of battle between two sides. And I think that sounds nice. We've heard this line that people say, "Oh, rights are not pie. If if somebody gets rights, then they don't take away from other people's rights." But I think the reality here is, if you have a man who wants to use a women's toilet, women's showers, women's changing rooms, then that man's desire and interest is in conflict with the women who rely on that space for privacy and dignity. And that includes, all kinds of women, but, includes Muslim women. It includes women who've previously been victims of sexual assault, and just women who'd really rather not change with their male colleague who they may well have, known and interacted with as a man before he decided he was a woman. And so there really, really is a conflict there, and you can't get around it by, being nice. I mean, that's part of the problem of how we got here, was women were told, be nice, budge up. And so what it does require is saying no to one group of employees. And so that, in the end, that does require sort of taking sides, as, enforcing any rule does. You have fire escapes and somebody wants to put something in front of the fire escape. You say, no, sorry, you can't. And I think sort of getting back to those clear rules is where we have to go. But it is going to mean saying no and taking a side.
Sorry, I might have made the point clumsily. I totally agree with what you say, and I actually think one of the biggest cons around EDI has been this idea that nobody needs to lose out; we can all win. And I think on many different aspects, that's just not a grown-up conversation. I guess what I was thinking was, I think maybe if we could go back in time. And as Tanya said, the early days of, "Oh, this all looks lovely," and kind of go, "Oh, hang on a sec, let's just think about this, and let's try and plot a way that is genuinely respectful for everyone." But part of that grown-up approach means there's trade-off and there's compromises, right? And in your articulation is absolutely right, that if someone says it's my absolute right to be able to use whatever gender facilities I want to use, and you've got somebody else saying, kind of, I want to be able to use, single sex, then you can't square the circle, right? And that's what the court ruling actually gave some clarity on, which is why I think it's a good thing. I guess all I was saying was, maybe, we've got into a position where it's quite entrenched now, because it is felt that one side pushed very strongly for a long period of time, and maybe women were told to be nice and be kind, and that was some of the debate. And actually, the pushback that's going on now is trying to re-establish that kind of power balance. I always think, with the benefit of hindsight, a more adult conversation earlier on any topic pretty much normally gets to a better outcome than one which requires people to dig in order to reassert themselves because they've been pushed to one side. And I guess that's what I was referring to. I don't think it means there's no trade-offs at all, because of course there has to be if there are two very, very opposing views on something, and that's why you require lawmakers to opine on those things, because they bring the clarity to it. I guess it's more that I think the debate has sadly become, kind of more emotional than perhaps it might have been if the lawmakers, government, others had engaged more in a more grown-up and adult way earlier on. Was the point I was trying to make.
I certainly think that's true, and I think government, both as lawmakers but also as employers, that if you can write the best laws, but you also need to implement them. And if government had implemented the Equality Act from the start in the right way, then nobody else would have gone wrong. But they didn't. And so, I think it's very hard to find responsibility in this. Everyone's been looking at everyone else and going, oh, well, they're doing it. And now everyone has to do a great big 180-degree turn.
One of the phrases I'm using is there's plenty of blame to go around. That seems like definitely the one. I've noticed, I wanted to ask you, Neil, because I just looked up today that Severn Trent is on the Stonewall Workplace Equality Index for 2023, which I have to say I didn't realise until today. Does that mean that it was possible to work with Stonewall without adopting this sort of self-ID policy? Because that happened under you, right? I mean, I think there's an idea that if you are a Stonewall employer, that you've bought into all of it, and almost that you've just followed all of their legal advice, some of which may have been a bit iffy. But it sounds like that's not the case. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we take advice from a load of different organisations, and not just on this topic, on a whole range of topics. You don't follow all of it, and you don't apply all of it. And I think, the work that we did with Stonewall was particularly to help in terms of lesbian, gay, and bisexual kind of policies within the organisation, because we've got larger populations of within those groups. But I mean, there are parts of Stonewall's advice that we would never have applied to our organisation.
Interesting. It's just giving me some insights.
I mean, I think I was just going to say, one thing we find is that, sort of bad practice gets awards, gets shouted from the rooftops. Nobody feels frightened of saying we've adopted all of Stonewall's guidance. They get pats on the back, but anyone who has quietly been sensible has done it quietly. And so, the incentives for people to, and often for smaller employers, when the question comes to them, and sometimes it can be about one person, what do? Well, they go online and they Google and they find Stonewall and they find that this is what they're supposed to be doing, and so they do it. Whereas the organisations that have found their own way and done something sensible have tended to duck the limelight for obvious reasons, and somehow we need to reverse that.
I wonder if new people considering signing up to Stonewall would have seen the big names on the list and thought, oh, well, if they're all on it, they must have said yes to everything. And that actually was a leap, because they might have been on it and still not said yes to all the requests that were coming from Stonewall. So maybe it was a bit of smoke and mirrors in that respect as well.
I think there's a whole other podcast, right, on indices and kind of the whole thing about indices. And I think Maya's point is absolutely right. There is no doubt that if you want to feature at the top of any of the indices, there is an incentive to adopt all of the guidance, policies, and approaches that organisations that they stand by. And that's not just Stonewall. That's a whole range of different ones where it's kind of like, do these 10 things and you'll feature more highly. And I think you always take a trade-off as an employer that says, actually, what am I trying to do here? Am I trying to make sure that I've got perspectives, guidance, and advice that then I can choose what I take or I don't take? Or am I blindly trying to get to the top of an indices because I think it will look good on my annual report that I can put out and say this, that, and the other. And I think you're right. I think the easiest way to get very high scores on anything is just to wholeheartedly apply everything that is said to you. And I've got no doubt that Stonewall, like other indices, probably had that impact on some organisations. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. It seems like lots of employers trusted the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, to give them good advice on this. And it now seems that the advice that they received may not have been that great. There were two different guides that the CIPD brought out, one in September 2023 and one in, I think, November 2024. And that first one was, I think, quite widely read and I think quite widely adopted, and that was widely available. The second one was a bit of a rollback and was much more quietly announced, and I think is behind the paywall, so it was less obvious to everybody. So it now seems it's not really quite clear what's happened since then. It looks like they're quickly going away to rewrite everything. Am I right in thinking, Neil, that you haven't been that impressed with the CIPD's response to the ruling? Can you just explain a bit where you are with it at the moment?
So look, I'm not going to beat up on the CIPD. I'll leave that for other people to do. I think they,
I love it.
they do some really good stuff and they do some average stuff and they've done some stuff that they get wrong. And I think, from everything that I can see, they got this wrong. And I guess what they could have done differently, and what I think sometimes is a more adult approach, is when you get something wrong, is to come out and say, we previously said this, we got it wrong. The Supreme Court has said this, and now we're going to amend everything that we're doing. So if you followed A, B, C, D, E, please don't do that anymore. Now take this approach. I think what I felt was they weren't quite as explicit and as honest as that, and they could have been. And I think, running businesses, running organisations is hard, and everybody makes mistakes. And I think it's good leadership to talk about when you make a mistake, to articulate that you've done so, hold your hands up in the air, and talk about what you're going to do in the future, rather than almost trying to segue away from it. And it felt a little bit like that when I read their comms. It felt a bit as if they weren't asserting that. And why is that important on this specific topic? It's because organisations will be looking to other people for a lead, for advice and guidance. And so simply clarifying what isn't right actually can be as helpful as saying, and here's what you now need to do. And I know you can say we're going to wait for the full guidance to come out, but actually in the meantime, you can actually give some clarity around what you can do now. And I thought that could have been quite helpful to have done. But they're not the only organisation to make mistakes. We all do. But I just felt it felt a little bit like a bit smoke and mirrorsy in the way that they comms it out.
Did you have any thoughts, Maya? Because you've been in touch with them over the years, haven't you?
Yes, yeah. I've met with Peter Cheese and written to him and poked holes in the first version. I've not really looked at the second version. I mean, I think the guidance started from the wrong place. It said, this is guidance about your trans and non-binary employees, and in drawing up your own policies, you should consult with your trans and non-binary employees. That's just the wrong place to start. Your policy should work for all your employees and be in line with the Equality Act, and you should consult with everybody. As soon as you start saying we're going to have policies that are set by a very small group, and you don't think through how those policies might affect others, you're going to come unstuck. So I think they will probably be wanting to, change, make small tweaks. But I think that the whole approach to their guidance was wrong. And if you look at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, they will have to make small tweaks to their guidance, but they didn't have the kind of approach that CIPD had and others like the NHS Confederation. There was nothing in the current EHRC guidance that says, don't do naming, so-called dead naming, don't do misgendering, come down hard on transphobia. These are sort of ideological edicts. All the Equality and Human Rights Commission said what was something about your single-sex spaces, which is one very small part of the issue. All of these other organisations ran with it and said, if you don't believe that trans women are women, then you're a bad person with a controversial opinion which may not be welcome in the workplace at all, rather than your opinion aligns with law and biology. And so, I mean, they really are going to have to go back to the drawing board, not make small changes. And the idea that waiting for the EHRC is the answer is it's just ducking responsibility.
No, I think I broadly agree. I mean, my eyes are a lot closer to the guidance itself, but I kind of, it feels to me that well, it depends what you've done as an organisation, the guidance you've given, right? But I think pushing responsibility onto other people and saying we're just going to wait for that when you've gone out previously with guidance outside of that feels a bit kind of disingenuous. It kind of feels like you want it both ways. And that's what I say. I think it could have been a nice opportunity for organisations to role model getting stuff wrong, and I think that's life, isn't it? People get stuff wrong, and maybe good leadership is just owning up to that.
Yeah. Okay, talking of getting things wrong, Neil, you've kindly agreed to do a follow-up episode to this one, answering questions from HR professionals who've got themselves into a mess with this or are struggling kind of since the ruling. So we'll do a sort of deeper dive into that, and I'm welcoming questions from employers on that one. There'll be a good Q&A session. For those who can't wait a week, could you give just maybe a couple of tips and takeaways just to tide them over? I know when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the sort of pushback they might be receiving and the pressures on them at their end. Could you just maybe give them a couple of tips, just if they're starving for some good advice and feeling a bit leaderless?
God, yeah. I mean, I guess there's some practical stuff, isn't there? And then there's some cultural stuff as well, I think. So in terms of practicalities, I guess, one of the things I'd be suggesting to people is they go back through their kind of documentation, their policies, their processes, their training, and start to do an audit of kind of what have they introduced version control over a period of time, and basically understand, have they got, what have they got in the organisation that isn't aligned with the clarity that came from the Supreme Court ruling? And I think that's kind of like a practical thing you can start to get into right now, and understand what you need to unpick, if anything, in your organisation. I think the part about kind of culture and inclusion, I think it's really tricky, right, to on situations like this, if perhaps you've been giving out one specific narrative in your organisation, to suddenly kind of change that narrative over a period of time. But I think, one of the things that people have got to be very careful of is coming out with immediate emotional statements around, whether it's about kind of, we're not going to change our approach, or some of the things that I've seen around, which I think won't age well. I think recognizing that different people in your organization will have different viewpoints around this, and recognizing all of them is really important, rather than just recognizing one side of an argument or another. I think that's kind of key. And I think you probably take it as a bit of a lesson in terms of, if you have got your narrative wrong over a period of time, then, what lessons can you learn from that in terms of other topics, other situations, other issues that are live, about maybe, where you need to stand as an organizational way, maybe where you need to not have a visible stance. So there's some practical stuff around policies, procedures. I wouldn't go running to lawyers. I wouldn't go paying for lots of advice at the moment, because I think you'll just get bang average advice right at the moment. But I do think you can start to do that audit, and I think you can start. And look, lots of organisations won't have narrative at all on this topic. So they won't need to come out with big statements or big internal messaging for ERGs or anything along those lines, because they won't have been in that place. But if you have, I think really thinking that through is quite important. Thinking about how you do that in a in a genuinely inclusive way, rather than perhaps what initially might be seen as inclusive, but might actually be more polarizing.
You mentioned ERGs, which of course is employee resource groups or staff groups. It's all the same thing. I think a lot of people are feeling quite a lot of pressure from their LGBT staff groups particularly. And is there a sense that there's a danger people might get drawn into negotiating with those groups, when that you presumably wouldn't advise that kind of situation to evolve?
Well, I think it depends how you've been using those groups historically as well. And I think there's a whole load of pitfalls that you can get into in terms of, groups deciding policy or deciding process rather than being about support and inclusion. I think, I certainly wouldn't get into a negotiation with anyone other than our trade unions, and that would be normally about pay terms and conditions. I mean, wouldn't negotiate with anyone else. I do think the tonality of any response is going to be really important, and I think recognizing that the law is the law, and as companies you follow the law, and that's what you do as organisations, and actually, that is different to the culture that you have within an organisation in terms of how you might, create support for all and safety for all, is very, very different to following the law. And so trying to separate those two things out, I think is probably important. But the safety and the inclusion has to be for all. It can't be focused on just specific groups. And, to give a non-connected example of this, as you and I have talked about before, Tommy, a large percentage of my population are white working class men. So when we talk about EDI, I need to think about inclusion of white working class men as well, because inclusion does mean everyone. It doesn't just mean certain groups. And so, very similarly, on a topic like this, you've got to think about everyone and how you make everyone feel safe rather than just particular groups.
And you would just deal with individual people with actual concerns about, say, for example, which facilities they're going to use. You deal with them individually, would you, rather than a sort of in a group?
Yeah, so I think, as an employer, if you've got employees who are trans employees, and you've got practices in place for them, you need to understand whether those are in line with the law or not in line with the law, for one. If they're in line with the law, there's probably some conversations around, just general line management. I think that's different to making a big statement. If they're not in line with the law, then you're going to have to change the practices that you've got in place, because they'll be illegal by definition, and therefore you need to make sure that you're having those conversations as well. But I think that's different to taking a big statement across the organisation. I think the only time I would consider anybody doing that is if they've previously made big statements on this topic. Then they're going to have to think about what they do, because otherwise you're going to leave your entire workforce feeling confused about it.
Do you have any questions, Maya, for Neil on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that distinction between organisations that have just sort of not made big statements and those that have is really important. Do you think the organisations that really have bought into this and made allyship statements and condemned so-called transphobia, do you think they should now be apologising?
That's a really interesting question. Do I think they should be apologising? I think there's. Come back to the point about if you've made statements that you've got it wrong, I always think as leaders you should come out and say we got it wrong. That's on any topic. I just think that is good leadership. I think if you've had a particularly heated internal debate because you've got an ongoing or you've had an ongoing conflict within your organisation, you've opined one way or another, and you've got it wrong, I think you probably are going to have to do some apologising and saying, we got that wrong. I think I would hope, and you're probably closer to this than I am, but I would hope that most organisations would have been sensible enough in their approach and their comms that they can take this as a useful point of clarity in which to move forward. But I'm sure there are organisations out there that have gone well beyond where they perhaps should have done, and now will either need to quietly change their position, which I guess is probably what most will do, or like I say, show some leadership and say, sometimes we make mistakes, and we made a mistake on this one. And whilst we're not throwing out all this good stuff about making people feel psychologically safe at work, because that's really, really important, on these policies or these processes or the way that we approach this, we got that wrong.
So we'll do another session giving some more detailed advice to HR professionals. I'm thinking about, so we covered a little bit about LGBT staff groups, but also I think it might be difficult if people have got senior colleagues for whom this subject is quite close to the bone. For example, if they're a parent of a trans-identified child, I think there might be some difficult conversations that need to happen at more senior level, which might be hard to navigate as well. And I think also with Pride looming large, and I think I've seen some of the activists already are starting to turn on the brands that they feel have let them down by following the ruling. I've seen some stuff about Barclays already. They want to boycott Barclays because Barclays have made the changes to their policies. So I think employers should probably anticipate needing a bit more support with that sort of thing. And I'm hoping also, Neil, if we can put some useful links into the show notes for this episode as well, things that you recommend that people read as sort of sensible advice in the meantime, that would be really helpful as well. I guess, just a point about trust and balance and things. People might be wondering why I haven't invited a panel of people with different views on kind of for balance or for debate. The answer to that is that I spoke to several seasoned, sensible HR directors about this topic over the last 3 weeks, and they all agree with your position, Neil, on this. In addition, I couldn't find an equivalent of Maya on what might be termed the other side. So I couldn't find anyone who was disappointed by the results and who wasn't also looking to delegitimize the Supreme Court ruling, which is just not a discussion I'm prepared to get into. I guess that's just my decision, my editorial decision for this podcast. And then when I look more closely at these groups and individuals, the messaging from some of their campaigning since the ruling seems to be very emotional and actually quite disruptive, which I didn't think was very helpful or even responsible, given the high number of young and or impressionable people who follow them. So I didn't feel comfortable platforming them here. But I guess, ultimately, I suppose we all have to decide, don't we, who we think the sensible people are. I think the people on this call sound pretty sensible, but feel free to seek a range of perspectives if you're listening, just to be aware that I guess some people are deeply, personally and financially, frankly, invested in this, and helping employers to avoid legal risk is probably not necessarily their top priority. Do either of you have any final words? Maya, shall I just go to you? Even any questions for each other? Final words or hopes moving forward from here?
I hope that corporates, big employers, take leadership from the top. I think this is not a big technical question. It's a question about tone and leadership. They should just start reading J.K. Rowling books in public, or inviting me in to talk to them, or talking to their scene networks. Just publicly talk to the people who were previously pushed aside, and show that those people are worthy of respect in a democratic society. And if other people kick off and say you shouldn't have done that, then they're exposing that they're not in a good place to be in a workplace. I think it really has to come from the top, because this problem has been embedded so strongly, and it's just a question of leaders recognizing that we were right.
Have you been invited to speak at the CIPD Festival of Work, which is in June?
Not yet, no, but I was invited to the House of Lords for that. There was a 15th anniversary of the Equality Act. I've got this is my mug. It says, it's the Equality Act, stupid. 15th anniversary of the Equality Act celebration at the House of Lords, and that Stonewall was there and various different organisations. And that was the first time we've been invited to be in a room in polite company. We should have been there 5 years ago, but we're there now. And I think that's what organisations should do is invite the people who weren't into the room at the highest level, do it publicly, and then people will, most people just want to get on with their job, and they'll be relieved, and they'll go back to being sensible.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree, Neil, that this sort of conversation should have happened a long time ago?
Yeah, I mean that point about most people want to get on with their job, I think is absolutely spot on, right? I mean, we've got challenges in the economy around productivity, we've got challenges in the economy around service levels, waiting lists in the NHS. We've got so many things that we could be focusing on driving to create, a better economic and social environment for ourselves in the UK. And I think, we need to accept the law when the law is the law, get on with it, apply it, and just get on with the myriad of other things that are in front of us. And I think if organisations can do that, then we'll probably create, a better country, a better economy, a better society than if we continue to argue over things that have been made clear by the highest experts in the land.
Great. All right. Thank you so much to both of you for joining. I hope you've maybe both learned something and enjoyed the conversation as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanya. Really nice to meet you, Neil.